Christoph Sorg. Recording in process. Okay. So I'm a social scientist. I'll say something quickly about myself and then about the theme. I'm a social scientist interested in planning. I study really everything about planning, the history of planning, capitalism, the history of ideas surrounding planning, and theories and ideas of post-capitalist planning. I've written a paper called Finance as a Form of Planning for the journal Competition and Change. This is a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be based on. I'm also a member of INDEP, International Network for Democratic Economic Planning, which is co-hosting this event. Uh, INDEP is a network of basically activists and scholar activists. They're united in the rejection of market economies and command economies, rejection of both, and in basically thinking that major economic decisions should be democratically decided instead of leaving them to market forces or state authorities, which democratic economic planning can mean a lot of things. So it's a very plural network. Yes, if you're interested in the network, maybe Eric, can you post forgot to
I,
post the link. You can post the link. There's
link.
always stuff to do if you'd like to join. There's a closely related planning. I'll put the link there. Planning research is a planning netform by Jan Gross. It's kind of related to the network with text collections, databases on democratic planning. And yes, but also only slightly related to the network, relatively autonomous. There's a lot of people who are interested in socializing and democratizing investments, so we decided to form a working group. If you're interested in joining that, just write an email to me, message me in some kind of way. I'll put you on the email list for the first meeting. Yes, I think that's just general housekeeping. I'll quickly introduce the theme of the workshop and only then introduce the speakers. So you,
Super quickly, Christoph. Where should people reach out to you if they want to become
ah,
part of the working
yes,
group?
I can't. So my email's address is I'll put it in the chat. Also, if you Google me, it's on my university page, Christoph.sorg at hu. What do you call that one in English? HU Berlin.de. But I'll put it in the chat and you can find it on my homepage. Yeah, don't want to interrupt the presentation, so I don't want to mess around with the infrastructure anymore. So I'll put it in the chat later. Yes. So the idea for this event was basically to bring together two different themes and related networks. One is democratic planning bubble, which is a really quickly growing literature and network of activists, as already mentioned. And the other side is work on the democratization of finance, and by extension, also on the democratization of investment. And it's something that in planning debates recently, the socialization of investment been very prominent and has been something that a lot of different approaches managed to agree on. So I think it's really close to work on the democratization of finance and social control over finance. The intersection of those two ideas is that investment is really pivotal for the direction of social development. It's really pivotal for directing our creative capacities, if you take a bird's eye view. And that for this reason, social and democratic control over investment is pivotal for a democratic, just, and sustainable economy. When I say investment, is basically there's two things that I mean. One is private companies retaining profits and reinvesting them, and the other is investment by the financial sector at large. Um, I think it's fair to say, go on with the slide, that we have seen a financialization of planning in recent decades. Financialization has really increased the importance of financial markets in shaping planning of both companies and states via shareholder value principle, via the rise of institutional investors and central banks, via increasing public debt, and so on and so forth. I think that different forms of de-risking that we've seen recently are the contemporary expression of that, using public money to make investments for private finance attractive. which is a form of public planning, albeit one that socializes risk and privatizes profit. And so a question about possible alternatives could be framed like this: how to democratize the decision-making over investment and direct it at needs within planetary boundaries, which is a question of ownership, but not only a question of ownership. Thomas Marois, I hope his name is pronounced in French, I never know. He argues that public banks sometimes behave just like private banks and that their investment politics are subject to constant contestation. So it's not only about ownership, but it is about ownership. When thinking about alternatives, we could imagine a series of immediate reforms that you can find in the literature on democratizing finance. So that might be something like establishing democratic control over central banks and reappropriating them as a tool for planning, expanding the cooperative financial sector, more public investment banks at the national and municipal level, and so on and so forth, which would all establish more social and democratic control over pools of investment, and would establish the possibility to steer these pools to steer markets in general and the economy in general towards social and ecological goals. Yes, so that would be immediate reforms. Among those who go further in suggesting systematic post-capitalist systems, we have market socialists and advocates of democratic planning is one way of structuring that field. There's probably others. I really find it fascinating that market socialists like David Schweikart and John Roemer and others suggest that social ownership of the means of production is compatible with market economies on the one hand, so that's the notion. But at the same time, they both establish that a socialized financial system would be a way to steer the economy to plan in such a socialist market economy. So that's market socialists. And those who propose democratic planning as an alternative to market economies, so frame it as not market economy, but democratic planning, they suggest that all investment should be socialized, basically, all major investment. And I think it's particularly the work of Pat Devine and work in that tradition. It's kind of new Manchester School of Planning, Aaron Benanoff and others. And that work really illustrates the difference, where Pat Devine proposes that company surpluses should flow into sectoral and regional bodies that then deliberate over the expenditure of social investment, thereby create a rift between price signals and social investment. There's a lot more to say on the Meitner Plan, Quebec Solidarity Funds, participatory planning in Kerala, the history of debates about socializing investment and left-wing social democracy in the 70s. Loads more, but I'd like to stop here to not go on too long, looking at the time limit. And I'd like to return from theory of alternatives to present dystopia, I'm tempted to say. There's a lot of questions a workshop on democratizing investment could ask. I'll put a couple here just as a framing the debate. But there's probably other questions we can come up with. So one question would, of course, be what could a democratized financial system look like? How could we establish it? Is the ecological crisis the context that renders legible that investment is too important to be put into private hands and into the hands of financial markets at large? Are there contemporary real-world experiences with democratic investment we can learn from? As I said, probably lots of other questions, and the inputs that we have today will probably raise some more questions. I'd like to warmly welcome and introduce Josh Mason and Sushovan Dhar. Very excited to have both of you here. Josh Mason, J.W. Mason, if you want to Google him, is Associate Professor of Economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. He has written too much for me to summarize, and I highly recommend his homepage, jwmason.org. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can find on this homepage, a lot of interesting writing. But what's particularly interesting for this workshop and what I wanted to highlight for people interested in planning is a series of articles in Jacobin. I think actually Michal Rosowski and Lee Phillips credit Josh as one of the people who has been a long-term expert on planning and who has been aware of planning for a really long time and who inspired them as well. But those Jacobin articles include one on the corporation being a form of socialization within capitalism, one called Socialized Finance, an article that argues that finance is a form of planning and it should be socialized, as the title says. And most recently, an article on the Green New Deal. There's loads of other articles, but I found those three particularly relevant for planning and for this workshop. And then we also have Sushovan Dhar here, who's a long-time activist and trade unionist, here today as a member of the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, CADTM. CADTN has done amazing work for debt abolition across the globe for decades, but CADTM has also long called for the socialization of the banking sector, as one of the articles puts it. In fact, for me personally, it was at a CADTM workshop on socialization of finance a decade ago that I personally heard the word socialization for the first time. And I kind of forgot. It was either in Tunis or in Liège, but I definitely remember talking to Sushovan there. So it's very nice to see you again. And that kind of for me, it was field work, and I was supposed to transcribe that in November 2016, and then I scrolled the Jacobin homepage, and that's where I found the Socialized Finance article by Josh Mason, which I found completely fascinating at the time, and I still do. So for me, it's very exciting to see the both of you here. And I'd actually like to open the floor for Josh first. I need to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, Josh, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So the starting point for this conversation, it seems to me, is that planning is everywhere in the economy that we already live in. There's a widespread idea that production today is organized by and coordinated by markets. This idea is ubiquitous in economics textbooks, of course, and it also forms a major part of our unspoken economic common sense, even for many people on the left politically. But it seems to me that when you look at things more critically, the role of market coordination in the economies that we live in is in fact rather limited. Within the enterprise, markets are almost non-existent. Production is organized through various forms of hierarchy and command, as well as through intrinsic motivation, what David Graeber calls everyday communism, or Jules Michelet called the professional conscience, the desire to do one's job well for its own sake. The formation, growth, and extinction of enterprises, meanwhile, is organized through finance. People sometimes talk about firms growing and dying through some kind of Darwinian process, but the function of finance is precisely to prevent that. By redistributing surplus between firms, finance breaks the links between the profits a firm earned yesterday and the funds available for it to invest today. The whole elaborate structure of banks, stock markets, venture capital, and so on exists precisely in order to make funds available for new firms or firms that have not yet been profitable. And on the other side, institutions like private equity and the market for corporate control ensure that the surplus generated in one firm need not be reinvested there. It can be extracted, more or less violently, and used somewhere else. In both cases, this is not happening through any kind of automatic market logic, but through someone's conscious choice. Once we think of finance as a system of planning, it's natural to ask if it can be redirected to meet social needs. I want to make 4 suggestions about how I believe this idea can be pursued most effectively. First, we need to think carefully about where financing constraints matter and where they don't. Many firms do fund investment largely from their own profits. Not all investment is externally financed. Not all surplus is extracted. In other firms, investment spending is modest relative to current costs. In both of these 2 cases, where investment is financed internally and where investment is modest relative to costs of production, finance will have limited effects on real activity. Where finance is most powerful, on the other hand, is in new or rapidly growing capital-intensive sectors. capital intensive. That's important, especially where firms are relatively small. Green energy is an important example. For wind or solar power, almost all of the costs are upfront. Housing is another area where finance is clearly very important. While this is, of course, not a new sector, firms in housing construction are generally fairly small, capital costs are large, and there is a significant lag between outlays and income. So it's clear that booms and busts in housing construction have a great deal to do with credit conditions. On the other hand, labor-intensive sectors like care work are poor targets for credit policy since their capital needs are minimal. In those cases, subsidies or other real interventions are needed to redirect activity. Large established firms are also likely to be fairly insensitive to credit policy. There is a great deal of evidence that the internal discount rates that corporations use to evaluate investment projects are not tightly linked to interest rates. At best, financing can relax an external constraint where decision makers already operate with long horizons. Second point, channeling credit to constrained areas will have a bigger impact than penalizing credit to unwanted areas. This to me seems like an important and underappreciated point. It's a major limitation on, for instance, the types of green policies that we've seen adopted by the European Central Bank in recent years. For firms that already issue bonds, the interest rate they face is unlikely to be a major factor in their investment decisions. Where credit matters most is for smaller bank-dependent firms and households which face hard limits on how much they can borrow at all. This goes much more for the stock market. Firms for which stock issuance is a significant form of investment finance are a very, very small group. Stock issuance is almost never an important form of financing for real investment. And of course, most firms do not issue stock. Most firms are net purchasers of their own stock, certainly in the United States. So in general, changes in stock ownership we should expect to have no effect on real investment at all. Related to this is a question of rules versus discretion. It is relatively easy to write rules for what not to invest in. Targeting finance-constrained sectors, however, requires more strategic choices. And since, as I've argued, it's the targeting of finance that is where the greatest impact is, this is a form of activity that cannot easily be structured through uniform rules. This means that it is a state capacity-intensive form of policy. In a setting where state capacity is limited, credit policy is unlikely to work well. Similarly, if we want to see across-the-board changes in the economy, as opposed to fostering new growth in certain specific areas, credit is not the right tool for that job. There, it is better to directly regulate the outcomes that we are interested in. If we want higher wages, for example, we should write minimum wage laws. We should not tell our central bank to penalize holdings of shares in low-wage firms. Third point. We need to think carefully about which parts of finance we want to socialize and where new institutions are needed and where they are not. Various financial institutions out in the world offer funding to real activity, directly or indirectly, on their asset side, while issuing liabilities that some particular group of wealth owners wants to hold. In the case of many of these institutions, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, their social value comes as much from the distinctive liabilities they issue as from the activities that they finance. It is natural, therefore, to imagine public finance in similar terms and think that a public investment authority, say, would issue distinctive liabilities that are connected to the activities that it finances. You'll issue some form of green bond or social impact bond. I think we need to be very cautious about this idea. The connections between the two sides of the private balance sheet that are important for private institutions are largely irrelevant for the public sector. The public sector already finances itself on the most favorable terms of any entity in the economy. The public sector already finances itself on the most favorable terms of any entity. The private sector's need for retirement security and other forms of insurance can be addressed directly. Public provision of, say, new assets for retirement saving would be a step backward from current systems of direct provision of retirement security through Social Security systems. There is a case for new public liabilities within the payment system, a larger public role in both interbank payments and in the direct provision of banking services to those who currently lack them. But there is no good reason to link that service provision to public credit provision, and a good number of reasons not to link them. The strongest arguments for socializing finance, it seems to me, lie on the asset side of the public sector balance sheet. We do not need to find new ways of financing things that the public already does. We do need to bring public criteria into the financing of private activity. Finally, it is worth emphasizing that what matters is what gets financed and on what terms. Who owns the assets has no importance in itself. Setting up a sovereign wealth fund does nothing to socialize investment if the fund operates on the same principles as a private fund would. As an aside, I observed this firsthand some years ago when I worked in the Office of Investment of the AFL-CIO, the big United States Labor Federation. The idea at the Office of Investment was to use the substantial assets of union-affiliated pension funds to support labor in conflict with employers. But in practice, the funds were so constrained both by legal restrictions and by the culture of professional asset management that it was effectively impossible to depart from the conventional framework of maximizing shareholder value. All right, fourth point. We need to link proposals for socializing finance to a critique of conventional monetary policy. We need to challenge the sharp lines between planning, prudential regulation, and monetary policy proper. In reality, every action taken by the central bank channels credit towards some activities and away from others. One major lesson of the past 15 years is the limits of monetary policy as a tool for stabilizing demand. But central banks do have immense power over the prices of various financial assets, and monetary policy actions have enormous effects on credit-sensitive sectors of the economy. A program of using credit policy for what it can do, fostering the growth of particular new sectors and activities, goes hand in hand with not using credit policy for what it cannot do, stabilizing inflation and employment. In this sense, socializing finance and developing alternative tools for demand management are complementary programs. Perhaps even they are the same program. It is worth noting here that Keynes was very skeptical of the sort of fiscal policy that has come to be associated with his name. Keynes did not believe in large fiscal deficits. He did not believe that demand could be effectively boosted via payments to individuals. For him, stabilizing demand meant stabilizing investment spending, and this meant, above all, reorienting it away from considerations of future profitability, which is inherently unknowable, and beliefs about which are therefore ungrounded. This is a key element in the Keynesian vision that is often overlooked. Our ability to know the future matters less when we are focused on providing concrete social goods than when we are pursuing monetary profit. It may be very hard, even impossible, to know how much, let's say, the apartments in a building will rent for 30 years from now, depending as that does on factors like the desirability of the neighborhood, how much housing is built elsewhere, the overall state of the economy. But if we ask instead, how long will this building stand up? How many people can it comfortably house? Those are questions we can answer with reasonable confidence. Would it not be simpler, then, to stabilize private demand in the first place rather than to try to offset its fluctuations with changes in the interest rate or the public budget position? From this point of view, our current apparatus of monetary policy would be rendered largely unnecessary by a program of reorienting investment to meet real human needs. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I'd like to right away give the floor to Sushovan. And then afterwards we have time for discussion.
Do I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hello, and thanks to INDEP for organizing this wonderful conversation. I think I will restrict myself largely to the socialization of banks and the question of debts around it. In fact, 18 years after the international financial crisis, we can see the effects are still evident and rampant. Not only evident, but rampant. In early 2023, within a few days, 5 days in March 2023, we saw 3 US banks collapsing: the Silicon Valley Bank, the Silvergate Bank, and the Signature Bank. We also had the problem of Credit Suisse in Europe. And if we look at the list of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, I mean, the website of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation of the United States lists 571 banks that have failed since 1st October 2000 till date. So this is a process which is going on, and this is nothing very accidental, but it's more of it's normalized. So what we can see is that the systemic banking crisis has been consistent with the history of capitalism. Since I think the first recorded sort of banking crisis happened in Amsterdam in 1763 with the collapse of the Johann Ernest Gotskowski and leader Peter de Neuvil's bank, and the tremors were felt in Germany and Scandinavia. So what we see is that the banks are the center of the recent crisis from the very beginning. In fact, the subprime defaults, paralyzed Lehman Brothers, and when it faced a credit crunch, and when there was no state bailout available, the entire financial sector and the global economy went into a tailspin. The US crisis, the American crisis, morphed into Europe. And then we witnessed the debt burden of the peripheral states and the solvency of the entire European banking sector coming into a question. In fact, if you look at the Greek crisis, the infamous Greek crisis, we will see that primarily the debt of the Greek state was primarily to the European, the French and German banks. And by 2010, the Greek state was unable to service the debt. What it did, it didn't default, but what it did, it took fresh loans from the IMF and the European Union to pay off the banks. So effectively, the private liabilities were converted into state liabilities. And so this has been continuing, and we have a series of examples in all over the world, in Asia, in India, in Latin America, and Southeast Asia, many other parts. Faced with this, what we see we hear about certain bank reform legislations, for example, the Dodd-Frank Act of the United States, or the Lakenin report on the right of the European Commission's high-level report of the European Commission's high-level expert group on bank structural reforms in 2013, or the Basel III regulations, which Bank of International Settlements, the Basel III regulations, which spoke about capital and liquidity requirements. But what we see on the ground is once the initial shock is over, the banking sector lobbies hard to water down the rules. And it effectively creates a very low bar of compliance. And that's the reason it happens again and again and again and again in the system. In fact, we've seen the doing away of the Glass-Steagall Act of the United States, which made a distinction between separation between commercial and investment banking. But those were all done away, and but huge number of commentators allude to the financial crisis of 2007 to the abolition of the Glass-Steagall Act and things of that sort. So in effect, we have old practices going on in a new financial landscape, which is marked by even larger banks and which create a larger systemic risk to the global economy. In the face of this, what we've seen is mostly state bailout of the bank, which means either through emergency loans from central banks to sustain the liquidity mismatch of the banks, emergency program to restore solvency, and states buy billions of dollars of assets, which are worthless assets. Basically, when the bank fails, the asset values also goes down. Like, for example, the Troubled Asset Relief Program in the United States, or in the UK, what they did was a temporary nationalization, which in effect is basically public transfer of public money, transfer of public wealth to save the banks. So and in India, in the same thing it's been happened with huge corporate defaults since 2012. And when the banks went into a bust, it was rescued by the Indian state, the central bank, and the Indian state. So effectively, the banks are sustained largely by implicit and explicit subsidies by the states, which means that we have a scenario where we see a widespread socialization of losses and privatization of profits. The question is, why should profits accrue exclusively to shareholders if losses are socialized, or when we are forced to pay for the losses? That brings the largest moral argument for the socialization of banks. Indeed, we have this whole series of public sector banks, but the problem I think in many European countries, you have the public sector banks, the commercial and the commercial banks, the development banks, with loans to specific sectors. But the problem is that in the greater scenario of overall financialization, the public sector banks actually behave no differently than their private counterparts, and they're most often controlled by public bureaucracies that end up serving particular private interests. Therefore, public sector ownership of the bank is a necessary condition, but not sufficient to deal with this huge systemic crisis that we see all around. So therefore, this is the whole argument behind the socialization of banks. It's a question of public control. It's not only a control by public officials and the bureaucracy, but in a situation where citizens, unions, social movements, elected officials of various levels can actually be part of this larger control of the banks, and banks are socialized. In fact, as CADTM, we raise a few questions. We raise a few demands for the socialization of banks, which can be summarized roughly as that the socialization of the banking sector means expropriation without compensation, or compensated by one symbolic value of large shareholders. Small shareholders need to be compensated. Number two, granting a monopoly of banking activities to the public sector. The small cooperative banking sectors can also exist, but subject to same scrutiny, same oversight rules as the public sector. Defining with citizen participation a charter covering the goals to be attained and the missions to be carried out, and which places the public savings, credit, and investment entities at the service of the priorities defined by democratic planning process. Transparency, number four, transparency in the financial statements, which must be shown to the public in understandable form, which means also doing away of the Bank Secrecy Acts, which has largely kept all such dubious dealings beyond the eyes of the public, beyond public scrutiny. Also, the creation of a public service for savings, credit, and investment with basically a twofold structure, a network of small high street branches on the one hand, and on the other, specialized agencies in charge of those activities of managing funds and financing investments, not handled by the ministries in charge of, say, for example, public health, education, energy, public transport, retirement, the environment transition, etc. These ministries might be provided with the budgets necessary to ensure their investments and effective functioning. The specialized agencies must only intervene in these areas and activities that beyond the competence of the spheres of action of the ministries in order to ensure that all needs are covered, which means, in effect, the end of private banks. That is, once they have been appropriated and the small shareholders indemnified to an extent, the staff would be taken on in the public banking and insurance sectors with their length of service and pay levels guaranteed up to authorized maximums in order to crack down on excessive incomes, and wage increases for the lower paid, and their working conditions should be improved. So this is roughly what we proposed as sort of an agenda for the socialization of the banking sector, in order to free the people in the public banks from the grasp of the financial markets. I stop here and I'll be happy to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sushovan. Thanks to both of you to very, very interesting presentations and lots of content. So the idea here is that if the two of you, if you want to respond to each other, I think there's the two notions of socializing investment floating around. There's a lot of interesting insight into economic policy. There's also the notion of transforming ownership, this meaning of socialization, and kind of a financial producer-consumer association. If you'd like to comment on each other, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. I think there's a lot of, if I understand correctly, there's a lot
Fine
of.
for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm going to open the floor right away. We have about 30 to 35 minutes for Q&A.
Super quickly, like if Josh and Sushovan, if you want to respond to each other, I would like to keep that in the recording if you're okay with that. And otherwise, when we open it up to the whole floor, I would pause the recording for now, whatever you feel good with.
But this is where you can say the controversial stuff now. Let's stop recording.
No, I'm fine with it. Yeah, I'm here to hear and learn as well. Huh?
I'm just gonna pause it now then for now, and then we're clear on where we are.
Yeah, and we're going to record until the Q&A. Sushovan, Dhar and Josh Mason already presented. We talked about a bunch of things. One of the themes was existing planning infrastructure, so how and whether and how they could be appropriated, redirected, relationship between immediate financial reform and more substantial transformation of finance. The second session, so the idea of the second session, for some of it was the time constraints of all the participants, but it was also the idea to use the second session to talk a bit more concretely about experiments with democratic finance, what we can already see, what we can learn from those experiments, and so on and so forth. And yeah, so this is the introduction for you and for everyone else. Wait, I'm having issues with my screen. I wanted to introduce Mike and Melanie and Lavinia. Actually, I'm gonna introduce you each right before your input, so you can keep the information in mind during the presentation. It's probably a bit more convenient. So I'll start with Mike McCarthy, who's a professor at UC Santa Cruz. Mike is a critical sociologist whose work explores the past and the possible futures of radical economic democracy. He was also, and this is particularly interesting for here, he was a consultant of the California Public Banking Alliances, if I understand correctly, particularly the Public Bank LA. So he has some insights on those processes. And in general, he's done a lot of interesting work on class and solidarity in the past, which I highly recommend. But most relevant for this workshop is surely his brand new book, a Verso book, The Master's Tools, How Finance Wrecked Democracy and a Radical Plan to Rebuild It. How very fitting. Yeah, I'd also like to welcome Melanie and Lavinia. I'll introduce you after Mike's input, if that's okay. Which means, Mike, the floor is yours. Would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, I have just one slide.
Okay, perfect.
I'm just gonna share it if that's okay. Let's see if I can somehow manage to do this. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay.
But this is worse than before. Before
Yeah.
was better.
Now we have the presenter's view basically, and that makes it hard to read.
Should I get out of this screen?
If you can, that'd be good. Yeah.
Yep. This is better? Like this?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I don't want that. It's better. Okay. All right. Pardon me. I'm sorry. I'm a little slow. It's a little early for me. I usually get going around 10 a.m. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a really exciting conversation to be a part of, and I apologize for not being in the first session. I'm looking forward to watching it after the fact, but I was in fact sleeping. So yeah, I want to just maybe, I know we have 10 minutes, so I want to just maybe start by talking a little bit about some of the efforts going on in the US and California in particular about democratic finance, and then move into maybe some maybe more abstract comments about democratic governance. So in California, in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom and the Democratic Party passed a bill called AB 857, which basically set up a framework for establishing public banks in the state. And as part of that bill is a pilot program, essentially, which will support the establishment of 10 different public banks, principally located in different cities. But it's basically it's basically the cities themselves that need to go through the process of establishing these banks, getting them approved by the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, and financing them. So even though there's this bill, it's kind of this it's the role of the cities and organizers in the cities to kind of make it happen, right? And in California, there's two cities in particular where we've kind of seen the most progress in building public banks. Probably where the most advanced is in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Public Banking Coalition. They're currently moving through a process now of essentially going through feasibility studies about the passage, about the creation of a public bank. And also LA, where they were kind of a little slower to get organized, but are currently doing feasibility studies. The LA City Council last year, actually it would be 2 years ago now, essentially put up $460,000 to do a feasibility study of whether a public bank in Los Angeles could be viable and what it could be used for. Now, in all these cases, there's a pretty explicit recognition that these banks are going to prioritize community needs in different ways. Although what that means is kind of up for question. And that kind of raises questions about how these banks will be governed, raises questions about how their mandates will be established. And there's actually quite a bit of variation on this point between the different public banking groups in California. So the San Francisco effort has really conceptualizes the public bank in kind of more of a traditional way. The people that govern the public bank will be essentially appointed. They'll be experts. They'll be kind of directed by the city council and in terms of the kinds of issues they prioritize. But the LA Public Bank has a bit more of an expansive view of democratic governance, and they're toying with ideas about actual incorporation of popular assemblies and popular forms of democratic input into how the bank will be governed. So there's kind of it's a space where there's a bit of variation in terms of how people are thinking, like how would you even govern a public bank? Okay, so my own personal involvement in this is that I guess it would be 2022, 2023, around there. I worked with Public Bank LA to kind of help write a series of white papers that essentially that could be used in politics to make the case for the public bank. And we basically wrote 5 of these things. One is on how a public bank could address housing shortages by prioritizing investment in low-income and worker housing. Another is about how public banks could prioritize community wealth building through creating programs for the establishment and support of co-ops and other forms of community wealth. Another report is on how public banks can help finance various forms of green infrastructure. Then we had another one, which is basically how you think about the balance sheet of a public bank. And really where my work and kind of the things that I think about most came in is all about the governance of the public bank. And I basically helped write this report about how you could essentially govern a pool of finance democratically. And that's this complicated thing that you see in front of you here. And that report, in a way, got picked up a bit by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, probably about a year after we did that. And Tlaib was in the process of basically revising a bill that she submitted to Congress in 2019 called the Public Banking Act of 2019. And in the revision, it includes a more robust and expansive proposal for democratic governance. And kind of a key in that bill, the Public Banking Act of 2023, which is still sat in Congress, is the random selection of people in various locales, wherever the bank is doing its banking, to be brought into assemblies to help essentially create mandates for public investment, for the portfolio of the bank, for the different programs that the bank would want to sort of pursue and emphasize. And that's kind of really where my own interest and excitement is around banking. I'm not really so interested in the technical aspects or and I don't really know so much about the economics. It's the governance that kind of interests me most. All right, now I want to maybe just shift then, because I know I guess I have like 3 minutes or 4. I want to shift then to just talk about this graph you see before you, this figure that you see before you, which has arrows pointing in every possible direction that you can imagine. Now, typically, and I should say, I'm not by no means am I the only person that's thought about democratic governance in banks. There's lots of really interesting folks in the U.S. writing about this. Democracy Collab is an organization that has written really great reports that I encourage folks to read. Thomas Marwah has a book on public banks that has a really interesting part about governance. Thomas Hanna has written about it. Michael Brennan has a really interesting report with Democracy Collab. So there's a lot of folks kind of talking about it in different ways. But typically when we think about banks, you have like a board of banking experts, and then you have the different operational divisions, right? And in a public bank, the people that govern it are essentially themselves appointed. However, there's some real drawbacks with that, especially in the country that I live in, the United States, where our actual democratic institutions are not democratic at all, and the individuals that run it, at best, have a loose connection to the interests of ordinary people. So how do we get around this? And I think, for me, I think a key way of getting around this problem is through the tool of random selection, the tool of randomly selecting people from a population to participate in, to deliberate over, and to make decisions about mandates for investment. And that's kind of the pillar, if you want to think about it, of this graph. It's this figure, sorry. It's this people's assembly that can be used to draw people together. Let's say you have a public bank of Santa Cruz, which is where I'm at. Well, if the bank is basically principally doing programs and lending within Santa Cruz, Santa Cruz County, you draw people from Santa Cruz County. You bring them together and kind of deliberate over public finance, have discussions about the kinds of things that should be prioritized, and then make actual mandates for the bank. And there's all sorts of ways you could do this to ensure that the group of people that you've selected is representative. You could use basic sampling techniques to ensure that it's a accurate and diverse group. So to me, that's kind of an interesting possibility for the future of finance in the U.S. How do we think about essentially incorporating democratic mechanisms into what are traditionally top-down run institutions? Okay, there's I don't want to go over time because I don't like it when other people do it, and I don't want to be one of those people. But there's other aspects of this graph that I could definitely talk about, but I see that I'm now over time. So maybe if folks, let me just say this. One of the things that I've tried to kind of think about are the ways in which we can use democratic mechanisms to govern a variety of areas within a pool of finance. So not just setting mandates, but also potentially doing research about future areas to invest in, to also kind of to also generate reports and reviews that are publicly accessible, to oversee the mandates of operational divisions of the bank, to actually represent different social interest groups. So you might have a commission on green policy. You might have a commission on labor. You might have an indigenous commission if this is an area that has a robust indigenous community. And so there's ways that we can kind of expand out the democratic dimensions of finance beyond just simply a mandate setting body. And so I'll just leave it there because I don't want to go any further over time. But thanks so much for having me. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks so much, Mike. I think that like the democratic governance angle definitely contributes. It relates to a lot of unanswered themes that we had in the last session. Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce Melanie Brusseler. Brusseler is okay? Because this is
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
okay. That's basically an exam for me of like pronunciation I've made up in my mind, and now I'm checking whether they're correct. Melanie is a political economist. Yeah, I'm unmuted. And she's also the U.S. Program Director at the think tank Commonwealth. Commonwealth, I recommend their homepage. They've done some great work surrounding questions of ownership. Melanie particularly works on questions of green and democratic planning, industrial policy, microfinance. I highly recommend her writing on these topics, which you can find on her homepage. I'll post the link in the chat. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Great. And I figure I can keep it a little conversational. And although I am the US Program Director of Commonwealth, I think in terms of speaking about real test cases, I'll speak from my experience working on the electricity sector in the UK, which is what I kind of came to Commonwealth doing on our original grants. So to kind of start from that context, the UK has a relatively new Labour government, and going into the election and in the lead up, the Labour Party had pledged to set up a public renewables company called Great British Energy, which that campaign promise, I think, is certainly the legacy of the Corbyn moment, where Corbyn had pledged to renationalize the full electricity sector as well as doing fossil fuel phase out in the country. So I think it kind of was a lingering demand, a bit more salient in the UK left than what we might see in the climate left in the US, for example. And so our work at Commonwealth was really trying to advocate for a very bullish version of Great British Energy, and that required thinking through what was the current regime for subsidizing renewables and what might public ownership do differently. And I think from that we did like a pretty deep dive onto the UK electricity sector. So to kind of start with that, and then what public ownership might do, and then I think kind of some broader reflections around the de-risking versus socialization debate. The UK has what might be arguably called like the gold standard for renewables de-risking in global context. The UK has had a regime called contracts for difference in place since around 2017, I believe. And through this policy regime has brought about like a pretty substantial wave of investment in particularly offshore wind, which is it makes sense given the UK's like renewables like portfolio potential, but also it's quite striking because offshore wind is pretty capital intensive, especially compared to other renewables such as onshore solar, for example. So it's quite striking that this policy regime has been able to bring about like large capital investment in offshore wind. And the way that this program works, and the way that it's a de-risking regime, is to take a step back. The way that the UK electricity sector is structured, the UK electricity sector is fully privatized and it's been vertically disintegrated. That was the main thrust of Thatcher's electricity market reforms. And so the way that it kind of is structured now is we have independent power producers, so kind of like a large basket of players who invest in generation and then they service generation on a market, like spot market basis. And then there are monopolies for transmission and distribution, but then they're also privately owned. And the way that these actors all interact with each other is through like price coordination, where their investment, divestment, and then actual like operation of assets is really determined by these market interactions. And then into this, trying to induce renewables, we draw on the work of Brett Christophers to kind of largely agree that renewables, at least in kind of current market arrangements, are quite difficult to make privately profitable because of the way that they interact with, especially like wholesale markets. Renewables are highly capital intensive. They're quite variable, so that just means that they're very subject to merchant price risk, revenue cannibalization effects, and there's also kind of like a lack of like a natural hedge. So what the contracts for difference policy regime does is it creates an ex ante fixed price contracts for potential renewables developers such that it pretty much mitigates merchant price risk. And there is also a mechanism by which competitive discipline is maintained through this program. So it's run on a reverse auction basis. So these private developers are still engaged, or they're still subject to discipline to try to increase both technological development and like price competition amongst a set of potential investors. And through this program, there again has been like a wave of investment. The UK is like a relative like leader in offshore wind. But at the same time, I think that those like, facts should be caveated where, if we're measuring success of a renewables policy on like, is there renewable development or not? Obviously, the UK has done quite well, but it's still pretty far off from hitting the Labour Party's 2030 power sector decarbonization target. And so kind of measured against that, I think is the question we're trying to answer, like what would be a regime that's adequate for that? This de-risking regime, again, has been quite successful at delivering investment, although in recent years, it has been quite vulnerable to capital strike. And kind of a main thrust of some of our writing at Commonwealth has been that precisely in this de-risking regime, it's trying to like de-risk very particular aspects of like the dependency structure of this investment decision for these private renewables developers. But precisely in this de-risking, it creates further risks, or it's unable to de-risk other risks that might come up later, in particular on the cost side. So if you could think about it, contracts for difference are trying to de-risk this merchant price risk, but in so doing, make the investment decision much more vulnerable to cost increases on the producer side. And so, in thinking about what could public ownership do differently, we would argue that public renewables development could reorder the dependency structure, not just for the investment decision to invest in renewables or not, kind of like on a project by project basis, but can also really affect the full system of electricity and then the production and consumption networks feeding into and out of this. So while we would definitely support like renationalization and integration of the electricity system in one fell swoop, if that were politically feasible, we do still see a path through which public development can over time allow for this same project to occur, where a public developer can take a portfolio as opposed to a project by project view approach to engaging with like investments, where they're not just basing their investment decision making on like the profitability of any given project. They're thinking more systematically about the full project of creating the renewable sector in the UK, which actually is kind of interesting. The UK, even before the Labour government under the Tories, had basically said that the current planning of the system is being done poorly, and they renationalized the system operator with the desire to have greater coordination along the full electricity system, which we've likened to a composer being able to compose a beautiful symphony with no ability to assemble an orchestra to actually perform it, given that it doesn't actually have investment capacity. Um, and so kind of like in terms of like the actual concrete investments, we see quite a lot of potential for a public developer to be speeding up the investment in renewables and also doing it in a much more systematic basis. But then also from there, we would argue that the way that the UK electricity system is currently structured, there are a lot of inefficiencies in terms of these actors trying to coordinate their activities through prices and the price mechanism while trying to increase renewables penetration, such that we already are seeing these dysfunctions around curtailment and capacity payments, where basically like if you can think of like the system as a whole, it's like paying private producers to either like not produce electricity or to produce electricity based off of these systemic needs, when if you just had public control over assets, we could have like kind of more temporal control over the operation of assets as opposed to doing these capacity or curtailment payments, which we kind of, drawing on the language of Paul Samuelson, would say it's not just a bribe to capital formation, but a bribe to capital operation is the way that a lot of these payments are being introduced into the system. And then from there, I think that there's a really strong case to be made that socialization and decommodification of electricity serves a key macroeconomic stability function, where both there's greater ability to control consumer prices of electricity, which was quite important, which would have been quite important in the most recent energy crisis in Europe. The UK, especially compared to the US, suffered quite strongly from the explosion in wholesale gas prices. And then also, and we would say that's not just the consumer side, but also kind of thinking about electricity as being a core price that governs production and investment and other aspects of the economy, that's a quite important price to be controlling where possible. But then also we would argue that by socializing the investment decision-making function for like renewables investment, there's also the ability to de-risk investment in the private production network feeding into electricity production. So thinking about like wind turbine manufacturers, for example, are subject to quite a lot of instability, as well as kind of like distributional conflict with renewables developers that we think the state can absorb and reorder their dependency structure as well. Which I think is all to say, to conclude, I think debates about de-risking versus socialization have often posed the two as like complete opposites, where there's no room for the two to kind of, especially in the full field of the economy, be working in concert together. And kind of in reflection from our work on this sector, we would argue for like a kind of, as opposed to thinking about de-risking versus socialization, big green state versus the kind of like like BlackRock vision of things, thinking about the like building the green mixed economy and really trying to isolate where nodal socialization might be important, kind of acknowledging that there will be aspects of the production and consumption nexus for the transition, where actual socialization of investment around fixed capital assets is in fact necessary. But we have to stress, like, what does that do, and how does that then relate to the kind of still existing wider sea of private production, private finance, and private investment decision making? And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Yeah, there's Josh and Melanie, and I think with Daniela Gabor and a couple of people. There's a video on varieties of de-risking. Is I think the title. I highly recommend. I feel like there's a bit of a sequel going on. If you're interested in these themes, I highly recommend it. So we have one more input by Lavinia Steinfort from the Transnational Institute. Lavinia is a political geographer and a feminist eco-socialist. Works at the Transnational Institute, where she's the coordinator of the Public Alternatives Project. And she's done a lot of things, but what I think is highly relevant for this workshop is that TNI, McMaster's University's public banking project, and Eurodot are currently spearheading a proposal to replace private finance with a global ecosystem of public bank collaborations. And I'd like to note that Thomas Marois, whose book was mentioned, is, I think, as far as I understand, part of this McMaster's project as well. So there's a connection there. And I also wanted to note that Lavinia published a book in 2019 called Public Finance for the Future We Want. I'm going to post a link in the chat. Yeah, Lavinia, thank you very much. Also, it was complicated to fit everyone's schedule, so Lavinia has to leave at 6. So please ask your questions to Lavinia as soon as you can after the presentation. Thank you very much, Lavinia. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It is really great to be here. I do have a short presentation. I also send the link, so if anybody else can put it up, otherwise I can try if I have those Zoom rights.
Eric, could you give Lavinia the Zoom rights? If not, I'll in the meantime, I can open the link and I can click.
Try it now. It should work now.
Oh, sure. Yes. Let me see. Okay. Is this working?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Then I'm gonna go for the full screen. And yeah, there we go. Great. Thanks so much, Christoph, for the invitation and for everybody that helped organize this. I have been working at TNI for close to 10 years, and ever since it has been about democratization of the economy with a focus on public services and the energy transition. And in that work, we have been constantly linking the discussions around public finance to the areas of ownership and governance. So I see a lot of overlap in terms of political analysis with Melanie and Mike. So really great to be part of the same discussion. And in that work, we have been looking into struggles for deprivatization of public services. And just to kind of a bit more closely unpack the cost of private finance, I just want to share kind of our findings around this work, because I think it shows very clearly what's at stake. So first of all, yeah, no surprise, private finance, of course, must generate profits and pay out dividends to shareholders. Beyond that, we see that private contracts often involve high fees to consultants and lawyers, as well as the fact that many private operators, they tend to outsource parts of the work, which also pushes up costs. Then fact is that private operators tend to have a very short-term vision where sustainable financial management is often lacking. So a focus on cost-cutting measures that fires workers, for example, which goes at the expense of long-term sustainability, financial sustainability as well is a big issue. And then the higher interest rates that private entities tend to pay because they don't have the tax funds behind them as public bodies do, which often leads to almost double the interest rate, which makes a very big difference, of course, in the expense. And so just if you want to have a deeper dive into all this work around why public services, when they are publicly owned, work better, especially if it involves a collaboration between workers, communities, and public authorities. This public futures database is the first that really captures all those practices around the world, which has been developed in collaboration with the University of Glasgow and Public Services International. I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the work on democratic investment and public finance we've been doing, with a lot of it is depending on long-term collaboration with Thomas Morois, who has already been mentioned a couple of times. So I'll go a bit deeper into the public bank side of things. And more recently, we've been diving into public procurement as well, to kind of also repurpose the community wealth building frame for more global south local authorities like Sao Paulo, Zanzibar, and so on. And just to kind of share some of the findings around the public de-risking of private finance that we have been coming across with a focus on the energy transition, is that a UN commissioned report kind of showed, we have been doing these calculations ourselves because it wasn't really, like that political in the report itself, but the figures kind of pointed out that for every $1 of climate finance that the private sector invests in low-income countries, it actually takes $4 in public funds to get that one private dollar. In all of this, it's quite clear that the private sector is really not interested in financing renewables in global south countries, let alone financing climate adaptation, which is a very big concern. And that if we see private finance coming across, this is only happening because of a variety of public subsidies, whether direct subsidies or tax cuts or very high electricity prices, as we have seen in the energy crisis. And all in all, the cost of capital for green investments in developing, quote unquote, countries is typically 2 to 3 times higher. And what I think is very striking is that in these discussions up from the Green New Deal, the finance question is often de-linked in mainstream spaces from the ownership and the governance question in key socioeconomic sectors. So to more broadly discuss the function and how state-owned enterprises are a key player in building those domestic manufacturing and regional integration strategies, and that without this, the transition will basically be all about importing technologies for which many low and middle income countries don't really have the money. So all of this is, of course, happening in the context of vastly changing geopolitics, a turn towards militarization, and a kind of rush for critical raw materials, which is all happening under the banner of competitiveness, which is, of course, often only benefiting the elites. Just to give more of a concrete example around democratic investment, I wanted to share with you the example of Banco Popular, which Thomas Morois has been researching. This is probably the most democratic bank in the world because it is actually owned by 1.2 million workers in Costa Rica, because every worker that puts their savings for 1 year at this bank, they become an owner. So the highest governance body of this bank is actually the Workers' Assembly, consisting of 290 representatives of 10 key socioeconomic sectors. And it has a very explicit mandate and mission to serve the social and sustainable welfare of the Costa Rican people. And beyond that, I think it's very interesting how this bank is also collaborating with the more rural electricity cooperatives in the country. And as Melanie already shared a little bit more about the electricity sector and the relevance of that, I think it's also very interesting to kind of briefly highlight how there are many lessons to learn, I think, from Costa Rica, not just from this kind of democratic bank, but also from how they have still a publicly owned and integrated electricity sector, which consists of a utility, a state-owned electricity utility, alongside regional, municipal, public companies, and 4 big rural cooperatives. And this is kind of a combination of horizontal and vertical integration, where it's operating on the base of collaboration between these entities and not on the base of competition, as is the case in many European countries. So I think it's very important to kind of advocate for reintegration of electricity in order to have an affordable decarbonization, which is still actually far from happening in many other countries, except for Costa Rica, Uruguay, Denmark, and a few more. I just wanted to kind of share this visual where we have been kind of pulling the building blocks, how a public bank can be democratized, because public ownership only goes as far as democratization is put to practice. And I won't kind of read out loud what you see on this graph, but basically it's building on the struggle for democratizing Belfius, which was a campaign in 2016 that Frank van Aarschoot, which was now the director of Counterbalance, was co-leading. They really also centered the principle of subsidiarity, where the people that are most affected and should benefit most from a public bank are then involved in the decision making. And actually in that analysis, they learned from the practice of Sparkassen, the saving banks in Germany, where I think this is very interesting to spend a few more seconds on, because in Germany, these local saving banks have an interesting ownership model where the municipalities are the owners in the form of custodians. So they cannot make any profit, and they have a legally binding mandate that is followed and put to practice by a local board of stakeholders, including a number of rights holders. And as such, it really practices a level of democratic control, which we should also be seeing in public development banks on the national and international level. And maybe just to go into that kind of bigger dimension and zooming out, for very many years, we've been hearing from the World Bank, UN, OECD, and so on, that there is just so little public finance out there, and that actually we just need to put some public funds to catalyze a wealth of private investment, this kind of billion to trillion agenda. And of course, everybody here knows clearly that this is not the case, that hasn't been happening, more so in low and middle income countries. And actually, the reality is that there is over 73 trillion in public finance. This involves a number of sources. And of course, it involves so many long-term struggle on the ground to actually put accountability and democratic control at the center of these public banks. And I would just want to make the case to marry the debates between democratic investment and sovereign money, or if you will, modern monetary theory, MMT, a bit more. I think these are too much separate debates that really are more in need of each other than keeping them separate, to kind of see how the taxing and the spending of money through central banks is not just a reality we should be pushing for popular well-being in the global north, but actually, as Ndongo Sambasela has been making, Senegalese economist, this can also be applied to some extent for domestic capacity building around industrial policy in global south countries. And I think in terms of stepping up the theory of change in climate movement spaces, where the focus is still very much on local energy communities as a solution to drive decarbonization, something that actually hasn't really been happening. I think to also draw on the analysis of the Democracy Collaborative that already was mentioned, I think to utilize central banks where we can for popular public buyouts, I think it's very important to have actually that managed decline of fossil fuels, because as long as we don't coordinate a kind of ramping up of renewables with a managed decline of fossil fuels, which won't be happening if we don't own and govern these terrible entities as they are and transform them, then we won't see a transition anytime soon on larger levels. Sorry, I just go back here. If you just are interested in any more of this analysis in this report, quote unquote, Green Multinationals Exposed, we've been really diving into the business models of 15 of the world's biggest quote-unquote green multinationals to really understand better the extent to which also renewables are highly financialized, and again, to the extent that renewable investment wouldn't have been happening without a lot of public funds behind them. I will just end on this very big proposal that we have been developing with McMaster University and Eurodad for this global public banking ecosystem, which is really based on the realization that to actually meet any of the climate sustainable development goals, we need an additional 30 trillion US dollars in the coming 8 years. And well, this won't be happening as long as we continue to rely on private finance and underutilize all this public finance capacity. And what this is about is basically having policymakers calling on their public national development banks as well as their multilateral development banks to really begin fostering an intentional public finance ecosystem through accountable democratic collaborations. And as some of you surely are aware, the Financing in Commons database shows there are over 1,100 public finance institutions that can actually together much better finance and under better terms the great challenges we have in front of us. And again, this goes back to resetting the social mission and mandate of these public development banks. And as I've been learning a lot from Thomas Morat, and who has been saying this all the time, the extent to which we can really socialize and democratize finance all depends really on the social struggle on the ground. And I think, yeah, it would be great to see where our forces can converge to really have some wins around perhaps this public banking ecosystem or many of the other proposals that were on the table by the other speakers. And sorry to not be here for the full side of the workshop. Today is also my care day, so I'm a bit juggling different tasks. So yeah, stop now.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you very much once again to all three of you. In the previous session, I basically, so the idea is that the floor, if you'd like to respond to each other quickly, you're welcome to do so, but you don't have to. So if there's something that you found particularly striking, so Mike already, I think, has something. And then afterwards, we still have a total of 40 minutes, enough time for debate and also for
Super quickly, I would leave the recording running for the responses to each other, and then once we open it to the complete floor, I would stop the recording. So, yeah.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, I just have a question for Lavinia. That was really interesting. The one thing that popped out that was just really curious to me was when you're describing how the governance of the Sparkasse, and you said that the owners kind of take more the form of custodians. I was wondering if you could say more about that, and maybe go into a little more detail about that. It made me, is custodians, it made me think, are they custodians in the sense that they have certain fiduciary duties that in terms of how they govern it? I asked that question because it's in the US in particular. One of the things that I study, and actually much of what my book is about, it's actually not really about public banking per se. It's about the finance that workers already own, but they don't control, and things like pensions and large asset funds. And in the US, there's like major barriers to essentially controlling that and kind of allocating it in democratic ways because of fiduciary duties and legal requirements about how these collective funds are run. So I guess I'm asking that because I'm wondering, is it different in Germany, or are there lessons there that we can kind of look to for pension funds in the US?
Lavinia, if you'd like to respond. Josh, would you like to build on that? Lavinia, no? Okay, then Lavinia, you're welcome to respond right away.
Yeah, it's not that I have done a kind of separate study on the Sparkassen in Germany, so I can't go too much into detail, but what my understanding is that these municipalities, they have kind of the legal fiscal responsibility. So, but in their mandate, it's very clear that they are not the owners in terms of being able to access any of the profits of the bank. And that it's a diverse board of stakeholders, of local stakeholders, that together must fulfill this mandate, so that it's that the municipality can never go in a different direction than the combined collective interests of a certain locality. And the fact that this public mandate is also binding under law, I think, are a few of the elements that really have been standing out to me. And maybe, as I think it was very interesting to hear you say that for you, the democratization of governance is most important, since we have been working not just on finance, but really democratization of governance from other public sectors as well. What so far comes back again and again is kind of how to strike that balance between the workers of a certain sector, the communities, the users, let's say, and a degree of public authorities and the representation of them, so that the kind of balance of powers between these kind of constituencies seems to be very, very important. Yeah, and it was very nice to hear you talk about the random selection of citizens to govern investment, because that has also been coming back in our research. So I just wanted to give that back. Hope it was helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. Josh has raised his hand.
Yeah, there were a couple of issues that I felt like came out both in Mike's presentation and Lavinia's that I thought maybe I would ask them if they could say a little more about. One is the relationship of democratizing finance to a broader kind of democratic culture, a broader kind of culture of self-government and collective decision-making, because it feels like, on the one hand, you might say that trying to democratize finance is going to be challenging in the sort of democratize it in the sense that you guys are both describing, of sort of more direct governance, is going to be challenging without a culture and institutions that support that sort of collective decision making by ordinary people. But on the other hand, one might say one of the values of this model is that it helps build up that culture. So, and then the other thing that I would be curious, because it seemed to come out in both of your presentations, is the question of like decentralization versus centralization, which is also something we've been talking about in the first session. Is the model, the kind of model of sort of direct democratic control of financial institutions, is it one that sort of necessarily implies more decentralized decision-making, more local decision-making, maybe operating at a smaller scale? Or is there potentially a way that this thing can be, this model of collective decision-making can operate at national or international scales as well?
Thanks for the question. Mike has unmuted himself. If you want to go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, these are really. I think both of these questions are really crucial. Maybe just taking up the first one and then the second. So there's been a ton on the first question on democratic culture. There's been a ton of really interesting kind of experimental research and survey research kind of over the past 10 years on these experiments of random selection and their effects on the participants, their capacity to generate good outcomes. And basically I think if you kind of look at this literature, what we find is, one, when you draw people together into groups and have them deliberate and hear each other out and have a clear kind of objective that you're trying to figure out, one, it actually reduces top of mind bias. So the kind of biases that people have about issues, just a kind of a conversational context with other people that have different perspectives allows people to kind of see things from different vantages, and allows them to kind of, in a way, discover their preferences in a way that they might not have had they not had those conversations. And so that what we find in these experiments is that actually when you draw people together, they generate actually pretty good political judgments. They generate even on things that are quite technical. They can generate pretty good judgments from these groups. And also what we find, which is somewhat counterintuitive, is that like very diverse groups, when they're brought together, actually generate even better judgments than groups that are very similar, but let's say just like all very smart people. It turns out that like, you know, cognitively diverse groups generate better judgments than just experts on certain questions. So I think to me the random selection idea actually does generate democratic culture in the sense that you were talking about. And it's also crucial, I think, because it creates a context in which you can have actual cognitive divisions of labor. So take the investment of a public bank, or let's say take the investment. Let's say I'm a pensioner and I have a pension fund, and you know the pension fund is trying to figure out how to invest. Not everybody in the pension fund should have or needs to have full understanding of the investment practices of the pension fund, right? In democracy, we have representatives that we elect that are supposed to kind of learn issues in depth and do things on our behalf. The problem with that is capitalist democracy corrupts those representatives, and they actually don't do that. So like in a way, random selection is a kind of way to get around that problem of the fact that society is complex. There's lots of different decisions that we need to make about lots of different things. We should not be expected to know everything about everything. This kind of mechanism allows some people to be drawn together to kind of to figure it out, to kind of have a deeper understanding, and to kind of make decisions about it. So I would say that it actually is generative of democracy, and I'm a democracy purist, if you want to put it like that, in the sense that I have faith that deliberation will actually generate good outcomes. Some people would say the people are actually corrupt. They can't do this. But I'm a serious small d Democrat. So on the second point on decentralization and centralization, I think this is also really, really important. And I guess I would just kind of echo a point that Lavinia made in her talk, which is that I think subsidiarity is the right way to think about how to get at this question, which is the basic idea of subsidiarity is if you could solve something at a smaller scale, then you should do that. But the scale at which you solve something should be the scale that is appropriate to the thing that you're trying to solve. That's basically all subsidiarity is. So if we're talking about a bank that's going to finance housing in Santa Cruz, which where I am, well, maybe it should be a Santa Cruz bank. If we're talking about a pool of finance that it has a more national ambitions for developmental goals or for other goals that are better fit for a national level, then it should be a centralized national bank, maybe even a global bank. So I think the subsidiarity idea is more along the lines of you create institutions at the levels that fit the problems that you're actually trying to solve with those institutions, more than there's like a right, or let me put it in a slightly different way. The coffee hasn't fully kicked in. More than we should either have a centralized one single thing or just like a decentralized a ton of tiny local banks, right? It's kind of somewhere in the middle. So I would jump off there. Throw it over to Lavinia.
Yeah, I will just keep it short, so there's a bit more time. So basically, when it comes to culture and developing a democratic culture, Yeah, I think there's one dimension where, more broadly speaking, there was such a lack of policy proposals for many years that we, as the broad left, have been focusing on developing policy proposals, which is extremely important. But at the same time, we see, I think, increasingly kind of fascist culture kind of thriving everywhere. So how to kind of crack that culture nut is, I think, very, very urgent. And maybe without necessarily having the time or this being the space to answer that question, I do think that for a democratic culture to actually thrive, the importance of actual decision-making powers and having those decision-making powers on a structural level is, I think, of extreme importance. And then I'm just thinking of the climate citizen assembly that Macron, for example, put in place, or and there are just so many examples where citizens are deliberatively discussing societal environmental issues, and then their opinions, their advice, their proposals are just brushed off, especially the more radical ones, which just creates so much disillusionment, and I think is really a big part of the problem. So to actually foster that, yeah, kind of more democratic cultures, I think to really be ready in that fight to force governments to actually share those structural decision-making powers, because without it, we'll continue to lose, basically. I will just kind of end on the decentralization, centralization question, where I think we can really get stuck in either side. So to kind of build in a feedback loop where participatory planning really goes from grassroots up and all the way back. But when it comes to, for example, something as complex as the electricity sector, again, it's very, very difficult to lose yourself in either the nationalization or the community energy. So to really think through those skills and see kind of democratization as the kind of red thread throughout these skills is, I think, very important to get the subsidiarity principle right, and to also make sure we are tackling these challenges kind of on the infrastructural level, on the system level that we haven't really been winning at. So yeah, that was just some final thoughts, and I will stop talking and here, try to stay for a few more minutes. So thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Melanie, the question wasn't explicitly to you. You're welcome to comment, but you don't have to, of course. Otherwise, there's nobody on the list. Then I can jump in. Lavinia, the question.
Super quickly. I would end the recording now. Then if you open it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.